Hello kids, I'm Dr. Harshad Bhanushali. Today we are going to discuss about two basic tricks on solving a few MCQs of the chapter Principles of Inheritance. One very common question they ask you in this chapter, one very common MCQ which is asked in this chapter is to find out the types of gametes produced by a plant. What they generally do is they will give you a genotype and they ask you to find out how many types of gametes are produced by that plant. For example, they may give you a genotype capital Y, capital R, capital R, and they'll ask you how many types of gametes are produced by this plant. They may give you a genotype capital Y, small y, capital R, and they may ask you how many types of gametes produced by this plant. Another option they may give you is this, and they ask you the types of gametes. Now this is easy, but sometimes you may have this type. Or they may give you this type. Let's say if I talk of colored flower, so I would give you this option. Let's make it even more complicated. I can put this and this and this and this, and then I can talk of flower position axial. So this big genotype they may give you. Another, let's make it slightly different. This is an example of genotype. Now, if you get the genotype and if they ask you what type of gametes, how many types of gametes are produced by this particular plant, there is a method to be used, there is a formula to be used, and that formula what we have to use is 2 raised to n. Remember, this is a formula what you have to use, 2 raised to n, where n is the number of heterozygous pairs. That's your shortcut. That's your formula. Remember, 2 raised to n, where n is the number of heterozygous pairs. Very simple. Let's apply this formula. If you observe this genotype, you would find in this genotype, this is a homozygous pair, this is a homozygous pair. That means this genotype does not have any heterozygous pair. So I will say 2 raised to 0, anything raised to 0 is 1. So I will say this type of plant produces one type of gamete. If you observe this example, you find this is a homozygous pair, this is a heterozygous pair. So I will say this genotype, there is one heterozygous pair. So I will say 2 raised to 1, that is 2 types of gametes. So this plant would produce one type of gamete, this plant would produce 2 types of gametes. If you see here, this is a heterozygous pair, this is also a heterozygous pair, so it will be 2 raised to 2. There are 2 heterozygous pairs, that means this would produce 4 types of gametes. Now see this. It's a heterozygous pair, it's a heterozygous pair, it's a heterozygous pair. That means there are 3 heterozygous pairs. So I will say 2 raised to 3. So this plant would produce 8 types of gametes. Come on, if you observe this, you would find this is heterozygous. I'm underlining the heterozygous pair. This is heterozygous, this is heterozygous, this is not heterozygous. So I will say this plant also has 3 heterozygous pairs. So this plant would also produce 8 types of gametes. Apply here. Here also, this is heterozygous, this is heterozygous, this is heterozygous, this is not heterozygous, this is not heterozygous. So this also has 3 heterozygous pairs. So this will also produce 8 types of gametes. Whereas if you observe this example, you will find 1, 2, 3, 4. So 2 raised to 4, that is 16 types of gametes. So basically what you're supposed to do is, you are supposed to see how many heterozygous pairs are there in the given genotype. If they give you a genotype and if they ask you find out find out the types of gametes produced by this plant. If they give you the genotype of a plant, and if they tell you find out the type of gametes produced by that plant, what you're supposed to do is use this formula 2 raised to n, where n is the number of heterozygous pairs. Just check the genotype and find out how many heterozygous pairs are. If you observe this example, this is an example of a trihybrid cross, by the way. This is an example of a trihybrid cross. You can see there are 3 heterozygous pairs. So this type of a plant will produce 8 types of gametes. This is a dihybrid cross example. This has 2 heterozygous pairs. So this will produce 4 types of gametes. This also, if you observe, this is this and this genotype and this genotype. All 3 genotypes are different. All 3 genotypes are different. But all 3 genotypes would produce 8 types of gametes only because if you observe all 3 genotypes, the common thing what you find in them is that they have 3 heterozygous pairs. So that's the trick of solving the MCQs about the types of gametes which are produced. Just remember this formula 2 raised to n, where n is the number of heterozygous pairs, and it should help you to solve these type of MCQs. Okay, the second type of MCQ which generally students are asked would be an MCQ regarding the ratio. Now we all know that monohybrid ratio is 3:1. We all know that the dihybrid ratio is 9:3:3:1. Generally, this is not common, by the way. Generally, this is not common. Ask you trihybrid ratio, or if they ask you tetrahybrid ratio, then how would you solve that? We all remember monohybrid ratio is 3:1. We all remember dihybrid ratio is 9:3:3:1. How do you identify, how do you mark if they ask you trihybrid ratio, if they ask tetrahybrid ratio? For that, the formula is that instead of writing 3:1, I will write monohybrid ratio as 3:1:1. This is basic mathematics. Dihybrid ratio, I will write 3:1:2. In case you have doubts about this, I can write it, I can prove it if you want. 3:1:2 is multiplying 9:3:3:1. I'm proving what I'm talking of. So anyways, back again. 9:3:3:1 can be written as 3:1:2 mathematically by going by that same logic. If they ask you trihybrid cross, your answer would be 3:1:3. You can use rough paper and solve it. 3:1:3 I will write as 3:1 into 9:3:3:1, and then my answer would be 27:9:3:3:1. This is my trihybrid ratio. Moral of the story. What is your monohybrid ratio? If they ask you what is your monohybrid ratio, you will say monohybrid ratio is 3:1:1, which is equal to nothing but 3:1. If they ask you what is your dihybrid ratio, you will say 3:1:2, which is nothing but 9:3:3:1. If they ask you what is your trihybrid ratio, you will say 3:1:3, which is nothing but 3:1, again basic substitution, into 9:3:3:1, which is equal to, I don't have to mug up, I just have to calculate mathematically. I will say 27:3. 9 is to 9 is to 3 is to 9 is to 3 is to 3 is to 1. Of course, it's very rare, but if they ask you tetrahybrid ratio, also you have an answer. You will say 3 is to 1 raised to 4. So that's your trick. Monohybrid ratio is 3 is to 1. Dihybrid ratio is 3 is to 1 square. Trihybrid ratio, if they ask you, would be 3 is to 1 raised to 3, and tetrahybrid ratio would be 3 is to 1 raised to 4. That's the method by which you can calculate the ratios without mugging up values. Once you know this method, if at all they ask you, you have a method to calculate this. So that's about the two concepts which can be asked in MCQ, which you may find difficulty. If you use these methods, you would not face the difficulties in finding out the types of gametes according to genotype, and in also finding out the ratios according to the types of the crosses. That's it for now. Thank you.